Last night. At approximately 1:17 UTC, a fire broke out at the Saudi Aramco refinery complex in Jizan on the Red Sea coast of Saudi Arabia. And then, according to statements published by Yemen's Iran-aligned Houthi movement in a video statement released hours later, that facility was struck with dozens of ballistic missiles and cruise missiles and drones, while a second simultaneous operation targeted sensitive Aramco-affiliated facilities in Yanbu with additional ballistic and cruise missiles and drones. And NASA's satellite fire detection system subsequently confirmed multiple substantial thermal anomalies at the Jizan site that were not present in any prior observation window. While social media video geolocated by independent researchers showed large fires burning in the industrial area of the city. And the Houthi military spokesperson, Brigadier General Yahya Sari, announced in a statement carried by the group's Saba news agency that the operations were launched. In response to this blatant and criminal aggression, referring to Saudi airstrikes on the Yemeni port city of Hodeidah and Kamaran Island, launched roughly 24 hours earlier, while stating that their declared naval blockade of Saudi Arabia remains in effect, and warning that we will not hesitate to expand our operations and escalate our actions based on developments in the coming hours and days within the equation of a blockade for a blockade and an escalation for an escalation. This is not an isolated incident. This represents something darker about where this conflict is heading, and what the rules of engagement have become in a war that is now being fought across military, economic, and energy domains simultaneously. And this is the story of the Houthis strikes on Saudi Aramco refineries, why it matters, why it represents the first attack on Saudi oil infrastructure in 4 years, and why this specific targeting decision reveals something genuinely unsettling about the strategic calculus of the Iran-Houthi alliance, and what the global economic consequences are likely to be in the days ahead. Let us set the stage first, because to understand why these strikes on Jizan and Yanbu matter so much, you have to understand what these facilities are, what they represent in Saudi Arabia's oil export infrastructure, and how the Houthis were able to reach them with ballistic missiles and cruise missiles launched from Yemeni territory more than 400 kilometers away. And you have to understand how this escalation fits within the broader pattern of Iranian proxy operations designed to create multiple pressure points against the United States and its Gulf allies simultaneously. Let us sit with that detail for a second, because it matters. According to the Houthis' own statement, this was not a single strike on a single facility. This was 2 simultaneous operations targeting 2 of Saudi Arabia's most critical oil infrastructure sites at the same time. The first operation targeted what the Houthis described as sensitive Aramco-affiliated facilities in Jizan with dozens of ballistic missiles and drones. The second operation targeted sensitive Aramco-affiliated facilities in Yanbu with a number of ballistic and cruise missiles and drones. And according to independent satellite analysis, the outcome at Jizan was visible from space. NASA's firm's satellite system detected multiple substantial thermal anomalies in the eastern half of the refinery complex that were not present in any prior observation window, while regional media reported at least 5 explosions, and commercial flights to the area diverted or entered holding patterns. At Yanbu, the outcome was different. Greek security sources reportedly confirmed to Reuters that 2 incoming ballistic missiles were intercepted by an air defense system operated by Greek military personnel, and Saudi civil defense issued emergency warnings for residents before announcing the danger had passed after the intercepts. But there is no official confirmation from either Saudi Aramco or the Saudi government about the extent of damage at either site. Aramco did not respond to media requests for comment. 2 Asia-based trading sources told Reuters they had reportedly received reports of some damage at the Jizan site. And that is where the operational reality becomes complicated, because the Jizan refinery processes roughly 400,000 barrels of crude oil per day, which is significant downstream infrastructure, but it is not the strategic center of gravity here. The strategic center of gravity is Yanbu, and Yanbu is where the story gets genuinely more complicated. Because Saudi Arabia has spent 5 months rerouting its crude exports westward through the 1,200-mile east-west pipeline to Yanbu, bypassing the Iran-blocked Strait of Hormuz. That bypass solved the Hormuz problem by relocating it. Every barrel Yanbu loads must still exit through the Bab al-Mandeb Strait, which the Houthis declared a blockade zone on July 20th. The pipeline does not bypass the choke point problem. It hands that choke point to a different adversary, and both flanks are now under fire simultaneously. According to detailed reporting compiled by multiple outlets including Reuters, CNN, and the Financial Times, Saudi Aramco pushed its east-west pipeline to an all-time throughput record of 7 million barrels per day in March 2026, after Iran effectively shuttered the Strait of Hormuz. Of that 7 million barrels reaching the Red Sea coast each day, approximately 2 million feeds Saudi domestic refineries. The remainder loads onto tankers at Yanbu's north and south terminals. Signal ocean ship tracking data showed Yanbu loadings reaching 4.7 million barrels per day around July 13th, the highest in the terminal's history. Kepler data reported by AFP confirmed that Yanbu accounted for 92% of Saudi Arabia's seaborne crude exports in June 2026. That is not a secondary export route. Yanbu is Saudi Arabia's entire export operation during the Hormuz closure. There is no third corridor. Kuwait, Qatar, and Iraq have no comparable overland alternatives. Their Hormuz-dependent exports are completely stopped. And now the Houthis are targeting Yanbu. And here is where the broader pattern worth understanding comes into play, because this was not actually the only incident involving attacks on Saudi infrastructure during this general period. According to separate reporting on the escalation ladder that built to last night's strikes on July 20th, the Houthis declared a full naval blockade of Saudi Arabia, warning that vessels calling at Saudi terminals could be targeted anywhere within their operational reach. On July 22nd and 23rd, the Houthis struck Saudi oil tankers in Celia and Layla in the Red Sea, claiming the vessels had violated the blockade. Brent crude closed at $100.69 per barrel on July 23rd, its highest close since May, touching an intraday high of $101.01. On July 23rd, President Trump posted on Truth Social that the U.S. would hold Iran responsible for further Houthi attacks, threatening major military punishment. On July 24th, the Saudi-led coalition launched what it called a proportionate military response against Houthi military targets in Hodeidah. And at approximately 0117 UTC on last night, the Jizan refinery began burning. Each Saudi action triggered Houthi escalation, creating an escalation ladder that built predictably to last night's strikes. And the pattern itself tells you something important about what the Houthis either cannot or will not disclose about their own capabilities and intentions. And this is where it becomes genuinely important to understand the Houthis' targeting capability. Because the Houthis' ability to reach Yanbu's departing tankers without deploying a single vessel relies on shore-based anti-ship ballistic missiles, with approximately 400-kilometer range, which is sufficient to cover the full width of the Bab al-Mandeb and well into the southern Red Sea. Their targeting intelligence exploits the automatic identification system, a maritime tracking protocol required by international law for all commercial vessels above 300 gross tons, which broadcasts each ship's identity, position, destination, and course continuously over VHF radio. The Houthis cross-referenced that open-source broadcast data with Saudi port call records to identify Saudi-bound vessels. And that is where the strategic trap that Saudi Arabia walked into becomes genuinely more complicated, because the engineering story behind Saturday's attacks begins in the 1980s. Saudi Aramco built the East-West pipeline during the Iran-Iraq War as a strategic insurance policy against exactly the scenario now unfolding. A hostile power closing the Strait of Hormuz. For 4 decades, the pipeline sat largely dormant as a contingency. In 2026, it became the world's most important piece of energy infrastructure. The Petroline runs 1,201 kilometers from the Abqaiq oil processing complex in Saudi Arabia's eastern province to Yanbu on the Red Sea coast. At its designed maximum of 5 million barrels per day, it could not fully replace Hormuz-routed exports. Aramco pushed it to 7 million by converting parallel natural gas liquids pipelines to crude service, an emergency adaptation that sacrificed NGL export revenue for raw throughput. And here is the architectural problem the Houthis exploited. Every barrel that arrives at Yanbu via the Petroline must then exit through the Bab al-Mandeb, the 29-kilometer wide strait at the southern end of the Red Sea connecting it to the Gulf of Aden. The pipeline bypassed Hormuz, which is under Iran's control, and delivered Saudi crude to a port whose tanker departures pass through a strait now under Houthi control. Iran and the Houthis are the same adversary coalition. The pipeline relocated the choke point from one arm of that coalition to the other. And now let us talk about what this incident reveals about the broader ongoing danger still facing civilian infrastructure in Saudi Arabia in the aftermath of this escalation. Because that is honestly one of the most significant parts of this entire story. Separate from any questions about military strategy or geopolitical calculation, the Saudi Civil Defense issued warnings early Saturday for residents of Yanbu Governorate and Jizan province about a potential danger, without specifying the nature of the threat. The warnings were lifted shortly afterward, with Civil Defense announcing the danger had passed in both areas. There were reportedly no immediate reports of casualties or damage. At least 5 explosions were reported in Jizan, according to regional media, with commercial flights reportedly diverting or entering holding patterns. And whatever the strategic calculations may be, real people in real places were told to seek shelter and stay away from windows while ballistic missiles and cruise missiles were falling around them. And that is the human cost that this escalation will carry with it for as long as it lasts. And let us also talk about what this incident reveals about the broader ongoing economic danger still facing ordinary people around the world in the aftermath of this escalation. Because that is honestly one of the most significant parts of this entire story, separate from any questions about military strategy or geopolitical calculation. Brent crude surged above $100 per barrel in early Saturday trading, representing a roughly 40% climb over the course of July 2026, before paring some of the gain as traders awaited confirmation of any sustained production losses. Front-month Brent had already crossed the triple-digit threshold on July 23rd, touching $101.01 intraday. UBS strategist Giovanni Staunovo described a broader tightening of the oil market, noting Brent has risen roughly $28 a barrel over the past 3 weeks amid supply disruptions in multiple regions. And compounding the pressure on global crude markets, the Caspian Pipeline Consortium separately suspended crude loadings at its Black Sea terminal near Novorossiysk, Russia, after Ukrainian drone attacks struck tankers loading at the facility, adding a third, unrelated supply shock to an already volatile market. And whatever the strategic calculations may be, ordinary people around the world are paying the cost of this escalation at the gas pump, in their grocery bills, and in their cost of living. And that is the economic cost that this escalation will carry with it for as long as it lasts. And here is where it becomes genuinely important to understand what the Houthis are claiming about their own motivations for these strikes. Because according to the Houthis' own statement, this attack was launched in response to this blatant and criminal aggression, referring to Saudi airstrikes on the Yemeni port city of Hodeidah and Qamran Island, launched roughly 24 hours earlier. The Houthis say they are responding to a 12-year Saudi blockade of Yemen, and that their declared naval blockade of Saudi Arabia is a blockade for a blockade, and an attempt to respond to all escalation with escalation. Whether you agree with that framing or not, understanding their perspective matters. Because the Houthis are not just a militia, they are a political movement with grievances, and from their perspective, they are defending Yemeni sovereignty against what they see as Saudi aggression. And the pattern itself tells you something important about what the Houthis either cannot or will not disclose about their own capabilities and intentions. Because whatever the strategic calculations may be, the Houthis' willingness to escalate in this way, to strike Saudi Arabia's most critical oil infrastructure with ballistic missiles and cruise missiles, demonstrates a level of capability and resolve that most coverage has not yet fully acknowledged. And that is a genuine shift in the strategic calculus that this conflict will carry with it for as long as it lasts. And now let us zoom out and think about why Bahrain, Jordan, and Kuwait might genuinely be nervous about what comes next. Because beyond just this one specific incident, the governments of Saudi Arabia's Gulf allies are managing an extraordinarily difficult set of overlapping crises simultaneously. They are trying to project an image of stability and resilience to their own populations and to their regional allies, despite having hosted U.S. military operations that have made them specific targets for Iranian retaliation. They are dealing with an Iranian threat environment that has expanded from the Strait of Hormuz to the Red Sea, with Houthis controlling the Bab al-Mandeb Strait and Iran controlling the Strait of Hormuz. They are navigating fragile ongoing negotiations with mediators from Oman and Pakistan, while simultaneously managing Iranian and Houthi attacks on their own territory. They are grappling with oil prices above $100 per barrel that threaten their own economies, despite their status as oil exporters. And now on top of all of that, they are dealing with a Houthi strike on Saudi Arabia's oil infrastructure, an incident that demonstrates the Houthis' ability to strike Gulf state oil facilities with ballistic missiles and cruise missiles. An incident that either represents a genuine escalation into a new phase of the conflict or potentially a propaganda demonstration designed to create maximum economic disruption. And an incident that either side can or will not fully disclose the details about to the international community. Any one of these individual pressures would represent a genuinely serious challenge for a government to manage on its own. Facing all of them simultaneously, while also trying to maintain the appearance of stability and control in front of both their own populations and the watching eyes of the international community, is exactly the kind of situation that tends to breed the deep institutional nervousness and strategic uncertainty that Gulf states appear to be experiencing right now. And there are also questions here that simply cannot be answered yet, and I would rather tell you that plainly than pretend otherwise. We do not know with any real confidence the extent of damage at Jizan and Yanbu refineries, because neither Saudi Aramco nor the Saudi government has confirmed the extent of damage. We do not know whether Saudi Aramco can continue operations at full capacity, because Aramco has not issued an official damage assessment. We do not know whether this represents sustained disruption or temporary damage, because independent satellite analysis shows fires at Jizan, but no confirmed production losses. We do not know how Saudi Arabia will respond militarily, because Saudi Arabia has not yet issued an official response. We do not know whether this will trigger broader Saudi involvement in the conflict, because the Houthis' escalation may force Saudi Arabia's hand. We do not know how the U.S. will respond to Houthi attacks on Saudi infrastructure, because the Trump administration has not yet announced its response. We do not know whether Trump's threat of major military punishment will be carried out, because the administration has previously backed down from threats against the Houthis. We do not know whether this escalation will undermine the U.S.-Iran diplomatic pause, because the pause may have been designed to allow Oman-Iran talks to succeed. We do not know whether Oman-Iran talks on the Strait of Hormuz can succeed, given this escalation, because the talks were described as useful and forward-looking, but no agreement has been announced. And we do not know whether this represents the beginning of a new phase or isolated incidents, because the Houthis have warned they will not hesitate to expand our operations and escalate our actions based on developments in the coming hours and days. Anyone who tells you they have confident answers to all of that right now is telling you more than the available evidence actually supports. If this story raised as many questions for you as it did for me while putting it together, drop a comment below and let me know what you think. This pattern of escalating attacks on Saudi oil infrastructure actually reveals about the Houthis' capabilities and Iran's strategy. Do you believe this represents a new phase in the conflict, or is this primarily a propaganda demonstration? I read every single comment, and I genuinely want to hear your honest take on this one. The pattern itself, however, is clear. An organization that has systematically expanded its targeting from commercial vessels in the Red Sea to Saudi Arabia's most critical oil export infrastructure is an organization that is demonstrating a willingness to escalate the scope of its operations in ways that most coverage has not yet fully acknowledged. And whether that escalation represents a genuine operational achievement or primarily a propaganda demonstration is a question that will not be answered until independent verification becomes available. And that verification may not come for days, weeks, or even months. And by that time, the strategic impact of the escalation itself will have already been felt across multiple theaters and multiple domains. And that is the reality of this conflict. The escalation comes fast, the verification comes slow, and the strategic impact happens in between. And that is why this story matters, and that is why you need to track it. And that is why I will continue to bring you the analysis that you cannot find anywhere else. This is the story of the Houthis' strikes on Saudi Aramco refineries, told as clearly and as honestly as the available facts allow. Not a single incident, but a pattern: military, economic, diplomatic, and humanitarian. All set off by an escalation ladder that was climbed over the course of 5 days, and that will define the next phase of this conflict. This story is far from finished. Thanks for watching. If you want to understand this conflict as it keeps developing, the military operations, the strategic implications, and the human stories behind it are all still very much unfolding, and there is a lot more worth paying attention to in the days ahead. This is not a story with a tidy ending yet, and honestly, that is exactly why it deserves this much attention now. While all the facts are still being established, rather than days from now when the narrative has already hardened into something simpler than the truth actually is,